Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. As our stretch of mesoscale days centered on West Texas comes to a close today, we are looking ahead to a more synoptically evident, potentially significant severe weather outbreak sequence that is expected to take place starting tomorrow, Sunday, April 27th, and peak on Monday, April 28th, and then persist through at least Tuesday before another system on its heels impacts parts of the U.S. on Wednesday. So we have a multi-day stretch of severe weather with robust hazards expected. You can see the convective outlooks here from the Storm Prediction Center lit up like a Christmas tree with a lot of color. So let's take a look. We do have a severe threat today. It is a low-end severe risk, but it is a severe risk nonetheless. We're going to focus mostly in this video on the upcoming stretch of our potential severe weather outbreak the next few days. But here's what we have going on for today. We have a couple slight risk areas to deal with today. One out across southern Oklahoma and into far north Texas there along the Red River. We've had a lot of ongoing convection this morning that will persist into the afternoon, perhaps regenerate out across that area that will pose a risk for mainly damaging winds and perhaps a brief tornado or two. And then, just as I'm recording this, a slight risk has been added across eastern New Mexico into West Texas, basically from Midland, Texas, northeast or northwestward into eastern New Mexico, for the potential for a few supercells out in that region that could produce all severe hazards, including a tornado risk, 5% risk there in eastern New Mexico. It was just upgraded from a 2% risk. We just need a little bit more clarity on some of the features for today's setup, but there is a tornado risk out in that area, as well as a damaging wind and significant large hail risk. 15% hatched area could see some large 2+ inch hailstones out in that vicinity there. Then we get into our next portion of the weekend, and that is the start of our upcoming severe weather outbreak sequence. For tomorrow, we have a bit of a conditional threat across the entirety of the Great Plains, but the main threat is expected to focus on parts of central Nebraska, where a slight risk level 2 out of 5 has been issued for tomorrow, Sunday, April 27th, as this system gets underway. So slight risk there across parts of central Nebraska, with a marginal risk extending from the Canadian border all the way down to the Mexico border. So severe weather in some capacity is possible in anywhere within that dark green area, but particularly within the level 2 out of 5 slight risk there. Tornado threat is fairly conditional at a 2% risk right now. That could increase in upcoming outlooks. By the time you see this video, we will likely have a new day 2 outlook out, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But damaging winds and large hail are expected to be the main threats within the risk areas tomorrow. Then we get into Monday. Monday is expected to be the most robust day of this upcoming sequence. The SPC has gone with a rare day 3 moderate risk level 4 out of 5 in the red shaded region there. That includes southeast Minnesota, western and southwest Wisconsin, down into south central Iowa. So that includes places like Minneapolis, St. Paul, La Crosse, Wisconsin, down toward the Des Moines area. You are under the gun for that level 4 out of 5 moderate risk for severe weather with all hazards possible on Monday. Large enhanced risk extends from the Canadian border down into parts of East Kansas, with a large slight risk extending all the way back into West Texas. So a very widespread severe weather risk is evident on Monday, with the potential for significant severe weather. 45% hatched for significant severe weather there within that moderate risk region, with the hatching extending all the way into West Texas. Down along the dry line, we could see some significant severe weather as well. So lots of folks going to be under the gun on Monday, which could be a pretty significant widespread severe weather outbreak that does have an all hazards risk, including strong to intense tornadoes on the table. The threat will continue into Tuesday, day 4, as we have a 15% slight risk equivalent region from West Texas all the way into the northeast, parts of New York, all the way down into west central Texas under the gun as the threat continues on Tuesday. And that will wrap up this first system. And then on the heels of this first system that will be the main driving factor of our Monday moderate risk potential severe weather outbreak, we have another system on its heels that will impact parts of the southern plains, including southern Oklahoma into North Texas on Wednesday. So a very, very active stretch coming up. Multiple days of severe weather potential are evident as we head into later portions of this weekend, but especially early into mid next week. So let's go ahead and start things off here. We'll start with today's setup. Just real quick, want to take a look at what's going on today. Here's our visible satellite imagery. We've been raining all morning here in Norman with some pretty intense rainfall and flash flooding. Some intense thunderstorms as well. You can see all the clouds here out across Oklahoma. That is an ongoing convective complex that has been persisting for quite some time through the night and into this morning. Here's our current radar. You see a little bit of a more intense complex there, intense band just east of the Oklahoma City metro area with some strong winds in that. But overall, just very heavy rainfall across much of Oklahoma. You see all those green polygons there. Those are flash flood warnings. We've seen some pretty significant flash flooding this morning across Oklahoma. Stretching back into Texas, we go back to our satellite imagery. You can see the fine line here. That is the outflow boundary from this complex. This complex has put out some outflow winds. That boundary, as of midday, as I'm recording this, just before noon Central Daylight Time, that boundary is still sagging south, which is a little bit of a concern for the severe weather threat today. You see some more kind of rain showers, some cumulus clouds developing on the north side of this boundary as it sags south. That likely means that if that continues, that boundary is going to continue to sag south into parts of far southeast New Mexico, perhaps even down toward the Midland-Odessa area of West Texas, a little bit farther south than initially expected. So we'll just have to monitor that. If that boundary can stall, that will be an impetus for perhaps supercell development later on, with a threat for large hail, damaging winds, and perhaps a tornado or two. Very similar to the last couple of days, just a little bit more of a conditional risk based on the continued movement of this boundary, and not quite as favorable of ingredients as we've seen the last couple of days out there in West Texas and eastern New Mexico. All right, now let's get into our upcoming potential severe weather outbreak. Let's set the stage with what's going on right now across the U.S. We'll start at 500 millibars here, and right away your eyes are drawn to this big trough out here off the California coast right now. That is going to be our weather maker for the next several days. That's our initial trough that will be moving into the central U.S. tomorrow evening and then into the day on Monday. And so you see it's a pretty robust trough here, very close contours here at the center, strong jet streak rounding the base of that trough, 70 plus knots of flow there, impinging upon the Great Basin region, desert southwest. This will continue to meander here out across the desert southwest region over the next day or so, and then it will finally start to eject inland and start to traverse the Rockies as we go into the evening hours tomorrow. And that is going to be one of the main questions tomorrow, and it's what's leading to the conditionality of tomorrow's severe weather threat, especially outside of Nebraska, is the timing of this trough. It's expected to hang back a little bit and really start to eject out across the plains tomorrow night, which could be maintain some timing issues for tomorrow's setup and leads to some questions over whether storms will even fire, especially along the dry line in areas across Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. So that remains to be seen. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But overall, nice potent trough coming in that will be our main weather maker for our severe weather threat in the next several days. Here we are at the surface. We've seen a strong surface low start to traverse into the northeast, strong high pressure area down here across the Great Lakes and southward into the Midwest. And then we will start to see initial cyclogenesis sometime tomorrow afternoon as we start to get at least the first initial peaks of wind, of that stronger wind associated with the trough aloft to traverse the higher terrain of the Rockies. We'll start to see surface low development somewhere in Wyoming into eastern Colorado tomorrow, and that will help to be an initiating or driving mechanism for the severe threat in the slight risk area across Nebraska. A little bit of extra forcing with the surface low, even though, again, that trough aloft will hang back just a little bit until later in the day, perhaps into the evening on Sunday. The surface low will be developing and may provide some extra impetus for storm development out across the slight risk area centered on Nebraska. Again, farther south, a little bit less forcing here, a little bit farther removed from the surface low. So a lot more questions as far as the risk for storm development overall is along the dry line tomorrow in the southern plains. So that is what we have going on right now. Let's go ahead and take a look at our model data. So this is going to be, as we always do, a comparison and contrasting of the models for our upcoming stretch of severe weather, Sunday through at least Wednesday. So we'll start off with the 12Z NAM, 12Z GFS, and the 6Z Euro. The 12Z Euro not out as I'm recording this video just yet, so we're going to have to use the 6Z run, but should be good enough for our purposes here. So we're going to first focus on tomorrow's threat, Sunday, April 27th. And so let's start at 500 millibars here on the NAM. So here is our trough as initialized this morning out across the coastal regions of California. You see it just kind of meanders there in that region for the next day or so. Starts to slowly make its way east into the afternoon hours tomorrow. Jet streak still back in here out across, kind of centered on the New Mexico-Arizona border region right in there. So slowly migrating its way off to the east, and then this is at 0Z tomorrow. So this is going to be 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time tomorrow. You can hear the sirens outside. We're not under a tornado warning here in Norman as I'm recording this, but that is just the weekly siren test here midday on Saturday. So back to our setup tomorrow. This is again at 0Z tomorrow. You see that stronger flow aloft just barely starting to impinge upon the sort of the central high plains there. Colorado into Kansas, West Texas, western Oklahoma. We're just starting to see the first initial signs of that slightly stronger flow aloft impinging upon the region. And again, that is going to lead to some questions over storm initiation. Forcing should remain somewhat on the weaker side through much of the day tomorrow, until we get into the evening. That jet streak starts to translate into the area. Would not be surprised to see convective coverage increase just a little bit as we go into the overnight hours Sunday into Monday, although capping will be a concern as well. Strong capping should be in place through much of the day tomorrow, and then it will re-intensify after dark tomorrow. So it's just a question of whether or not we'll see any storms along the dry line, and it might be a short window. We might have less capping than anticipated. We'll take some soundings here in just a second to try to assess that risk. But overall, the timing of the trough may not be quite as favorable for eroding the cap across the plains on Sunday afternoon. And instead, we're going to have to wait until Sunday night and then until the trough ejects in full on Monday for robust severe weather to begin in earnest. But there is our positioning of the trough on Sunday evening, 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Jet streak right there across basically New Mexico. Center of the trough there in the Idaho-Utah border region. And we're just starting to see that forcing creep into the plains there by Sunday evening. Let's take a look at the GFS now, see if it has a similar progression of this trough. So there's our trough meandering its way eastward going into tomorrow. And here we are at 0Z. So very similar to what the NAM was showing, that almost a carbon copy, honestly. That jet streak there out across Arizona into New Mexico, centered there in northern Utah. Pretty much a carbon copy of what the NAM is showing. So the NAM and the GFS certainly on board with the timing tomorrow of the trough ejection. How about the European model? Let's go into Sunday evening, and pretty much the same here. European model basically on board with the others, and so we're seeing pretty high confidence in the timing of the trough tomorrow and the positioning of the trough by tomorrow evening. Stronger flow just starting to impinge upon the region of the plains there, western Kansas, Texas Panhandle. Will it be enough to initiate storms during the day? Given the timing of the trough, seems unlikely, but we'll take a look at things here in a little bit more detail as we head to the surface. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go down to the surface, see how the surface pattern is going to evolve as this trough makes its way in. So as you might expect, with the trough hanging back until tomorrow at the earliest, we're going to see a little bit of a delay in surface cyclogenesis. We're not going to see much of that today, given the positioning of the trough well back to the west. But as we go into tomorrow, probably about midday tomorrow, again, we'll start to see some slight pieces of that southwest flow start to traverse the higher terrain of the Rockies, and we will begin to see cyclogenesis by tomorrow afternoon. You see the surface flow starting to deepen there, some closed contours across eastern Wyoming into Colorado. So that surface flow starting to deepen there. We go into the afternoon tomorrow, 21Z, 0Z, nice tight surface flow there in southeast Wyoming, northeast Colorado. Ahead of that is where we're expecting the greatest focus of severe weather to be, out across western into central Nebraska. Down to the south, again, a little bit more in question, as the forcing is going to be delayed. We're well removed from the surface low. We will have strong flow in the low levels, and that should mean a strong dry line to make its way off to the east. Let's go ahead and pull up these surface observations right now and show you where that moisture is located. So you see those 60s dew points down across southern Oklahoma into much of Texas. That is kind of the northward extent of those 60s dew points, basically east central Oklahoma and areas southward toward the Red River, down toward west and southwest Texas. That's kind of your 60s dew point line. So the moisture not all that far away right now. So it's not going to take a lot to really start pulling that moisture northward. That will not begin until that surface low begins to deepen tomorrow midday to early afternoon. So this robust moisture down here will probably stay in place through tonight into tomorrow morning, and then by tomorrow morning into midday or so, lunchtime time frame, we'll start to see those 60s dew points rapidly advect northward as the low-level winds strengthen, as the surface low deepens, and we will see a very tight dry line develop. You see the air back here very dry. Dew points in the 20s and 30s out across New Mexico, far west Texas, dew points in the 60s there. So we should get a fairly tight dry line to develop, probably somewhere across far western Kansas down into the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles. And that will be any chance for storm initiation will come from the dry line. Now, the SPC does think that the dry line circulation may be enough to initiate storms down here. You see, they say that the dry line will extend from southwest Nebraska to Texas Big Bend. Mid to upper 60s dew points east of the dry line. Strong heating will support moderate to strong instability. Forecast sounding shows significant instability, inhibition along the dry line in the southern plains, with lesser inhibition with increasing latitude to the north. Weak height falls and a sharp dry line circulation could support isolated supercell development along the dry line from southwest Kansas southward. So they do suspect that there is a possibility for storm initiation, even given the weak forcing. But it just kind of remains to be seen if inhibition will erode enough to develop storms. We do see that the dry line should be fairly tight, very strong moisture gradient across that, likely some convergence along that dry line. So tomorrow is going to be a day that we're going to have to watch the morning observations very closely throughout the morning and early afternoon to see if storms will actually be able to fire in the absence of strong large-scale forcing for ascent. They did mention some height falls here. So you see out across this region, we do see fairly neutral heights through the day. If you keep your eyes on those, the solid black lines, those are our geopotential height contours there. Just keep your eyes focused on them, and you see they ever so slightly move off to the east going into tomorrow. So this contour here is there by 0Z, and then we go back, it's kind of in here by early morning. So very weak height falls here out across this region could be just enough, along with a strong dryline circulation. We'll do a little bit of work on the dryline circulation here in just a second to see if it will be deep enough to initiate storms. But back to the surface low there by 0Z up in the central high plains. Let's see what the GFS has to say. So you see by tomorrow early afternoon, nice surface low developing there, very almost more well defined than what the NAM has there in northeast Colorado. Very tight surface low, strong surface flow in the warm sector as that surface low deepens, so that should help us get a better chance for storm initiation up near the surface low. But a pretty similar overall scenario between the NAM and the GFS. GFS might be slightly stronger and deeper with that surface cyclone. Here is the European model. We go into tomorrow, strong surface low there in northeast Colorado. So the models are pretty much locked into the same solution tomorrow. Trough impinging from the west, slowly but surely, with surface low development there in northeast Colorado by by afternoon to evening tomorrow. Let's take a look at the moisture. The moisture is going to be critical here. So once again, that moisture, the blue colors here, those are your 60s dew points. Those are situated right now, as we saw, from southern Oklahoma westward into southeast New Mexico, southward into areas of much of Texas. So you see those kind of just meander out there through the day and nighttime tonight. And then by tomorrow morning, those 60s start creeping northward. This is 12Z tomorrow. 60s dew point line on the NAM here up from the Kansas-Oklahoma border down into west Texas, far eastern New Mexico. And that shifts northward pretty rapidly as we get that surface low to deepen by tomorrow afternoon. Now that is a pretty tight dry line. Let's zoom in here on the dry line. That is a very tight dry line, 60s dew points by 0Z all the way up into southern Nebraska. So for those areas, the moisture will kind of be just-in-time moisture. The more robust moisture will be just getting there as we get toward the sunset time frame. So may hold things more intense convection there off until after dark, but overall we should get those 60s dew points up by Monday night. But earlier on, we will get those dew points and that dry line to really sharpen across Kansas during the day. A little bit of a dry line bulge as well. We talked about dry line bulges before. It's where the dry line kind of bows outward. Those can be favored areas for stronger low-level convergence, stronger low-level shear for more intense supercell formation. So definitely would be watching areas here across western Kansas tomorrow if this dry line bulge comes to fruition for storm initiation. It does appear to be a fairly tight dry line. Extends down to the south as well. You see very tight dry line. It continues into the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles, west Texas region. So It is a very tight dry line. Let's take a look at the convergence along that dry line. Pretty healthy convergence. You see to the west of the boundary there, winds out of the south-southwest, south-southeasterly winds there on the east side. So pretty nice looking convergence along the dry line. Will that be enough to initiate storms? Still remains to be a question with this setup. Now I'm going to zoom back out here to our Kona sector, and then we'll take a look at the GFS, how the GFS handles the moisture here. So once again, we start to see that moisture in earnest move northward by tomorrow afternoon. And here we are by 0Z tomorrow. GFS also seems to be progging a little bit of a dry line bulge there in western Kansas. So that could be a favorite area to watch. You see there, very similar to what the NAM was showing, although maybe not quite as tight of a dry line down to the south. Still robust moisture off to the east with mid to upper 60s dew points in a broad swath east of that dry line. So fairly similar look between the NAM and the GFS. Let's take a look at the European model as far as moisture goes. And I bet it will have a similar solution. So the interesting thing here is the European model has those 60s dew points really unsullied up across southern Kansas going into tonight, where I think that may tend to be a little bit of an outlier solution. If we take a look here at our moisture, we see a lot of easterly and northeasterly flow across this region on the backside of this convective complex that's been ongoing all morning across Oklahoma. 60s dew points are south of that. I do think we'll struggle if the rain continues through much of the day, which it should here across Oklahoma. Those 60s dew points are going to remain relegated well to the south. You see just low 50s dew points across Kansas into northern Oklahoma now. And so I think that's going to stay put for much of the day. So the European model probably a little bit too aggressive with the moisture return here, but nonetheless, let's take a look. It has those 60s dew points up into Nebraska by tomorrow afternoon, which I think is a bit of an outlier. Does have a little bit of a dry line bulge there in western Kansas. So looking to me right now like the best chances for storm initiation, as the SPC says, would be near the surface low where forcing is a little bit stronger. But down along the dry line, all three models here are progging a bit of a dry line bulge into western Kansas, which would perhaps help storm initiation out a little bit. It's still going to be a little bit on the dicey side. Let me zoom in here real quick. Are we going to see any short waves here out across this region? So you see 250 millibar flow. We don't really start to see much in the way until late Sunday into Monday of that wave, that jet streak starting to move in. So, it kind of remains in question. 500 millibars. We barely start to see that stronger flow start to impinge upon western Kansas there by 0Z, 7 p.m. tomorrow. There are any 700 millibar short waves. So this is a little bit interesting here. So this has my eyebrows raised a little bit. Little bit of curvature there, slightly stronger flow associated with that curvature. So that could be a little bit of a short wave making its way through. This is at 21Z. Little bit of a subtle short wave there out across, overspreading the dry line by this time. That could be just enough for storm initiation out across western Kansas there along the dry line. So we'll have to watch that very closely. If we do get a little bit of a short wave to move through and overspread the dry line by peak heating tomorrow afternoon and early evening, that could be just enough to initiate storms in that region. So let's take a look at some soundings here across the dry line. So I'm going to take a sounding on the dry side of the dry line. And I'm going to take a sounding on the moist side, right ahead of that dry line bulge, kind of in that western Kansas vicinity. So this is a trick that Rich Thompson shows in his tornado forecasting workshop, and it tells you the ability for the dry line to initiate storms. So we're going to see the depth of our mix layer here. You see that strong inverted V profile west of the dry line. Extends up probably about up to here, about 600 millibars or so. You see where it kind of kinks back, the temperature profile there. We'll call that our mixed layer. Let's go to our moist side sounding here. So then we draw in the depth of our moist layer here. So our moist layer extends up probably, it's tough to say a little bit. That moisture is kind of right, it extends all the way up into sort of that 700, 800 millibar range, 750 millibar range there. The actual moist layer might not be quite that deep, but even if it is somewhat shallow, you see it does extend up above the base of that mixed layer there, which would take those rising parcels within that dry line circulation just enough, and that should be enough to initiate storms there. So again, that moist layer on the moist side of the dry line does extend up within the mixed layer on the dry side of the dry line. So that should be enough to allow updrafts to go up along the dry line circulation, and that should be enough to initiate storms along the dry line. So we are seeing some mixed signals here, but it does look like there is at least a decent probability for isolated storm initiation along the dry line tomorrow. Now let's take a look at this sounding on the moist side, which is very impressive. You do see that we are pretty much fully uncapped here by 0Z. Not much capping to speak of at all. So we are fully uncapped. Pretty good moisture there going up into the mid-levels of the atmosphere. 72 over 66 at the surface. That is a little bit on the cool side. I suspect that is way too cool here. And we do this trick a lot of the time. So let's call that Scott City, Kansas. So let's go to the NWS Dodge City, and we'll take a look at Scott City, Kansas tomorrow. Actually, let's go just east of there. It's kind of closer to our area of interest. So the high tomorrow, forecast high tomorrow, 78 degrees Fahrenheit. The NAM showing 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is way, way, way too cool on the NAM for tomorrow. So several degrees too cool. That means that we are probably going to see temperatures warmer than that. Will help to erode any lingering inhibition. And so we should be uncapped by 0Z. Could have a possible shortwave moving across the dry line, which is bulged outward there in western Kansas. With this kind of a profile, 3,200 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, strong instability, strong low-level shear, 40 plus knots of effective bulk shear, plenty to organize storms into supercells. And look at that hodograph, strong low-level veering of those winds with height and strengthening of those winds with height, with strong streamwise vorticity in the lowest levels of the hodograph. This is a pretty textbook sounding for significant severe weather with all hazards, hail, damaging wind, and tornadoes. The question again remains, will storms actually fire? That is going to be the main question. We do see some evidence tomorrow that storms could be able to fire along that dry line bulge in western Kansas. Again, the observations tomorrow will be very critical during the morning and early afternoon to help us out and see whether or not storms will fire along the dry line. So that is what we've got going for Sunday. Again, let's take a sounding up there into Nebraska. We'll take a sounding there kind of after. This is going to be at 3Z when the moisture is just arriving. Should have a similar looking profile there. Out across those areas, you'd expect a strong low-level jet. We do see more capping up here to the north. Again, probably too cool at the surface, but very strong kinematics up to the north near that surface low. Strong low-level shear with a strong low-level jet. Plenty of instability, but we do see that capping inversion hanging on. Let's see if the GFS has the same. So let's take a look. 3Z here. We'll take a look there. So you also see, we go to 3Z here along the dry line bulge, and you'll start to see that capping inversion probably start to work back in. So that's why the window may be short, and we need to initiate storms there. Right there you see we maintain strong kinematics, but the cap builds back in pretty significantly there just after dark. So the window for storm initiation might be short. If we can initiate storms in that time before the capping gets pretty intense, then we could see supercells become surface-based, and as we know, supercells that mature and become intense in an environment that becomes more hostile with time, but they actually formed in a favorable environment, can persist into that more hostile environment for longer. So if we can get surface-based supercells moving into this environment, the cap might not be too much of an issue, especially with such strong low-level shear, which can add to the buoyancy overall in the environment and help kind of negate the impacts from the capping inversion. But overall, fairly favorable looking profiles there along the dry line would give this at least some chance to initiate storms tomorrow. Given that we're uncapped, we may have a shortwave overspreading the dry line, and that dry line is tight with convergence and a dry line bulge there. Could be favorable enough for an isolated supercell or two to develop there in western Kansas, especially as we go into tomorrow. Down to the south along the dry line as well, Texas Panhandle. Depending if we see that shortwave, we might be on the backside of the shortwave here, a little bit stronger capping there as well. You see that not quite as favorable profile. So it looks like that sweet spot might be western Kansas for any dry line initiation tomorrow. All right, let's go ahead and back out here, and we will go back to the CONUS view, and let's take a look at Monday. as Monday looks again to be the most potent day of this setup, of this outbreak sequence, as the trough finally starts to eject inland into the central U.S. And set up a pretty favorable environment for significant severe weather on Monday. Okay, so GFS here, this is the NAM, GFS, and the European model. Let me go back here to that, and then we will go ahead and starting at 0Z Monday, so this is going to be 7 p.m. Sunday. So that trough back there out across the west, the main jet streak out across the desert southwest, and you see how fast this jet streak is going to translate off to the north into the area of interest. We see a very rapidly translating jet streak. It is somewhat of a positively tilted trough, so the trough takes on a little bit more of a, kind of gets a little bit more sheared out, if you will, with time, a little bit more of a positive tilt nature to the trough overall going into the afternoon on Monday. But that jet streak is translating pretty fast. Keep your eye on those red colors, and we'll do our technique espoused by the Broyles et al. Omega project. We know the fast jet translation speed is a favorable characteristic for tornado outbreaks if we can get a rapid translation speed of the jet in question. So basically for this technique, we go from 6Z, so that the night before our event, to 0Z the evening of our actual event. So we're starting at 6Z Monday, so this is going to be 1 a.m. Central Daylight Time Monday. Pretty clear to depict where our jet streak is. The centroid of that jet streak probably somewhere there in eastern New Mexico. And this is, again, just with the NAM. So there's our centroid there at 6Z. The jet takes on a pretty straight line path there up to the north, and by 0Z, the centroid is up there in northern Wisconsin. So that is a pretty solid distance here. So northeast New Mexico to northern Wisconsin. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to use our handy dandy distance tool for this here. So we go from basically northeast New Mexico all the way up to northern Wisconsin. That's about, we'll say about 1,030 miles. That's pretty long distance for that to travel. So we take 1,030 miles and then over 18 hours. So we divide that. Let's go 1,030 divided by 18. It's 57 miles per hour. 57 miles per hour, 2 knots. That is a 49, basically a 50 knot jet translation speed. The threshold for tornado outbreak scenarios is 40 knots. So we are well in excess of this that 40 knot threshold. We're about 50 knots here of jet translation speed on the NAM. That is a very rapidly translating mid-level jet, and that is certainly a tick in the box, a tool in this setup's tool belt, tipping it towards perhaps a significant tornado outbreak on Monday. Very fast translating jet streak, despite the kind of positively tilted nature of this trough. Doesn't really matter when you have such a strong, fast translating jet streak. Now, with a fast translating jet streak and a more positively tilted trough, that may mean a lot of forcing, and that could mean a little bit more of a messy mode up here, given our shear vector orientation with respect to the initiating boundary. So let's go down to the surface here. And before we do that, let's quickly look at the GFS, see how the GFS handles that. Very fast translating jet here you see across New Mexico by the evening before our event, and then that translates all the way up into the Great Lakes region by the evening of our event. So very fast translating jet streak, very similar solution here with kind of a sheared out, positively tilted trough. A very similar solution to what the NAM was showing. Here we are at 0Z. So pretty similar here. Between these two models, with the jet streak in a similar position, positively tilted nature to the trough overall. European model, likely going to have a similar solution here, and we do see that is the case. So these models pretty locked in here, which gives slightly higher confidence, and that's why the SPC was able to upgrade to a moderate risk. They have higher confidence because of good model agreement at this range, just a couple days out from our event on Monday. So looking at the NAM, let's go down to the surface here. We'll back things up to the evening before our event. So here that surface low is 7 p.m. Sunday up there in northeast Colorado in that general vicinity. Quickly translates off to the northeast. And then by midday or so on Monday, going into mid-afternoon, that surface low is somewhere up in the eastern South Dakota to western Minnesota area. So pretty fast translating surface low. We'll go to 21Z here, 4 p.m. Surface low up there in western Minnesota. We will have a warm front here off to the north. Looks like this is the synoptic warm front up in here, up into northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. Warm sector to the south of that. And we have a dry line / cold frontal boundary back here to the south. And this is going to be why we have such a widespread severe weather event. Let's take a look at the moisture here. So you see that moisture translating north ahead of that dry line by Sunday evening, rapidly continues off to the north going into Monday morning. And here is why we have such a widespread severe weather event. Look at the breadth of 60s dew points here out across this the region from basically the Great Lakes states all the way down to the Gulf Coast and Mexico border. So a very broad region of very robust moisture with this setup. Surface low again up in here. Synoptic warm front up in here with a little bit more of a moisture gradient up in here. Could be some early convection associated with that. Ahead of our dry line here out across the central and southern plains. Dry line / frontal zone, whatever you want to call it, will mix off to it will move off to the east a little bit during the day. And that is going to set the stage for a widespread severe weather event. So let's take a look at the northern portions of this risk right now first. So again, surface low, 18Z. The trough is going to be translating very quickly. The forcing will be right there across that region by as early as late morning to midday. So we're going to see fairly early initiation of the storms, especially across northern portions of the risk area. It could be a lot of convection up in here near and ahead of the surface low. Out here across these areas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin. So as we said, a lot of forcing and the orientation of the boundary with respect, with the shear vectors with respect to the boundary could be interesting up in here. So let's go 18, let's go 21Z. So surface lows here, dry line / frontal boundary is here. Warm front, probably, as we talked about, the synoptic warm front is probably up in this vicinity here, I would say, through that pressure tongue, with a little bit more of a secondary gradient down in here, differential heating boundary in there. We also see the potential for maybe a prefrontal boundary or two as well. With such a broad warm sector, that's always something you have to watch out for, is a very, any confluence bands or prefrontal troughs in the open warm sector, and we are seeing some evidence of that on the NAM here. You see the little kinks in the height contours here out across southeast Iowa into Missouri. That could be a potential boundary to watch for convective initiation in the open warm sector. So we'll go back to our moisture here. So there's kind of our setup for Monday, at least on the NAM. Broad warm sector, dry line back in here, possible prefrontal trough / confluence band there with our two warm frontal boundaries, you can call them, up in there to the north. So let's take a look at our shear vectors with respect to our initiating boundary. So you see here up along the main dry line, those shear vectors are pretty much parallel to the initiating boundary up in this corridor. Eastern Nebraska, Iowa, up into Minnesota. Fairly parallel nature of those shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. Lots of forcing here. If we had a little bit more of a negatively tilted trough, I suspect those shear vectors might be a little bit more off the boundary, just a little bit, and we'd have a little bit more robust low-level response up in here, but with a little bit more of a positively tilted trough, not quite the case, and therefore our shear vectors are not super favorable for discrete supercells up in here. Now, along our confluence band, you see those shear vectors are pretty much perpendicular to that boundary very nicely there. And of course, weaker forcing out in this region along the prefrontal trough. That could be something to watch very closely for prefrontal supercell initiation on Monday. So, but down here to the south, that is where I'm watching most closely for more discrete activity. You see down here along the dry line, those shear vectors are much more off, much more perpendicular to the initiating boundary. That could lead to a much more discrete storm mode out across those areas. A little bit weaker forcing, kind of in the right entrance region of this jet streak here. I'll draw that in green. So our jet streak extends all the way down in here. Our right entrance region would be, down in here out across this area of the dry line. May lead to a little bit less forcing, but still enough to support severe storm development there. And those would have similar risks as areas off to the north. Kinematically should not have much of an issue with this setup at all. It's just a question of storm mode, I think, at this point, for the robustness of the setup. So we'll take a couple soundings here. Again, something to watch will be where this moisture gradient sets up. Here could be a lot of early convection that shunts this boundary south, but the NAM certainly has this. We'll see if the GFS has this as well in the European model. Take a look at our moisture. So you see a much more rapid and widespread northward advance of the moisture into Minnesota and Wisconsin on the GFS. So certainly some differences starting to appear in the model solutions here for Monday with the northward extent of the moisture. The 60s dew points now all the way up into central Minnesota to Wisconsin, whereas the NAM had them much farther to the south here. And that will of course dictate where the most intense storms are able to fire, the northward boundary of where those most intense storms are able to fire. But pretty strong moisture here. Here is our initiating boundary as well. Down here across these regions, we'll take a look at the shear vectors. And we see, once again, fairly parallel up in here, perhaps up right on the surface low. We could see a little bit better chance for more of an arc of supercells there. But that's where forcing will be strongest, so that could negate that overall. A little bit better shear vector orientation up there near the surface low for storms to initiate. But could be strong forcing that might negate that a little bit. So we'll have to watch that area as well. We'll just have to wait and see where that moisture is able to set up. But down here to the south should be very robust instability. Down here to along the dry line, a little bit, again, better orientation of the shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary would promote a more discrete mode down here from basically eastern Kansas southwestward along the dry line than it is up here into Iowa and Minnesota, although up there near the surface low, a little bit better shear vector orientation, but stronger forcing. So we'll have to, that may kind of cancel each other out there. But let's take a couple soundings here from across the region. We'll take one, some on the NAM here. Let's take one eastern Iowa, or western Iowa, and then we'll take one down here along the dry line here in east central Kansas. So here we are up to the north near the surface low. This is pretty interesting. This is definitely not what I expected here with this surface low. Doesn't look like we have a very strong low-level jet response. So yeah, the moisture back in here, the low-level jet is displaced off to the east a little bit. That would make that kind of prefrontal trough there the favored area in this northern sector. As near the surface low, much weaker low-level shear. Still strong instability there, but out in the open warm sector, and this is very weird. I wonder if this is just the NAM being the NAM, pretty weird solution out here. Let's take a sounding on the GFS out here ahead of the initiating boundary. And yeah, this is a little bit more what I had in mind. So very deep moisture here, 80 over 69 at the surface, deep moist layer extending up above 850 millibars with strong instability aloft, 3,100 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, very fat cape aloft, with a wind profile that would favor all severe hazards, including tornadoes. Nice curvature there in the low levels of the hodograph. Not a ton of low-level effective storm relative helicity, but strong deep layer shear would favor a tornado risk up in there. Perhaps an increase in the low-level jet after dark there across those regions. I think the NAM, I would tend to discount the NAM at this point. These solutions just don't make a lot of sense. We'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. Yeah, this makes no sense here that we'll have this little instability along the dry line. So I'm going to throw out the NAM soundings here at this point. And so this sounding, this looks more like it. This would be up here, northeast Iowa by 0Z. You see strong instability. And now we have very intense kinematics, very strong low-level shear, strong curvature in the low levels of the hodograph, 2,700 cape. No doubt an environment that would favor significant severe weather, including strong tornadoes. Down here along the dry line as well, let's take a look there. And so we'll take one right in there, kind of in the southwestern edge of the low-level jet. And this is what we have going on farther south along the dry line. Strong instability, slightly shorter hodographs, about 40 knots of effective bulk shear. We do have some curvature in the low levels of the hodograph, not quite in that most favorable wind profiles there as we saw up north, but still would favor all severe hazards. So still some questions as far as the overall profiles on Monday, but certainly that the significant severe threat should maximize up here southeastern Minnesota, western Wisconsin into Iowa, where that low-level jet is strongest, with a continued threat down to the south along the dry line in the kind of tail end of that low-level jet core. Eastern Kansas down into Oklahoma could see some supercells with all hazards there. Of course, we'll get a little bit better information as we go into the next couple of days, but let's go ahead and quickly take a look at Tuesday into Wednesday. So we'll go back to 500 millibars. So the trough continues to kind of shear out into two pieces. So we have this main piece that will be our main driver for Monday. And then we have this piece down here across the southwest into the Baja California Peninsula that will kind of become more isolated as we go into Tuesday. That will we'll kind of be stuck in the middle here. I suspect Tuesday will kind of be more just of a cold front day, more of a clustered linear mode, not a ton of real robust severe weather like Monday. On Tuesday will just be storms along the cold front from the northeast down to the south. Could be the most intense severe storms up here in the northeast ahead of this jet streak up in here. You see the expanse of moisture extending all the way up into the northeast. As that cold front kind of pushes down, that will be our initiating boundary. Could see severe storms all the way down into the southern plains. A nice dry line there in West Texas. Could be something to watch there. West Texas could be a spot ahead of that dry line as we get a little bit of forcing there Tuesday afternoon ahead of that dry line. But overall, we'll have a moist, broad, warm, moist air mass up across from a broad region from the northeast all the way into the Midwest, up New York. I'll just take a couple soundings along there. We see could be, I'm just not buying these NAM soundings here a lot of the for this. So just kind of take these with a grain of salt, but overall we should have strong instability, and some places should have stronger low-level shear, especially up there near the jet core in the northeast. Could be some tornadic activity up there. Looks like with such a veered low-level jet, could see more of a squall line there, fairly unidirectional flow, but strongest low-level shear could be up here in the Great Lakes from Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York regions. Southward into the plains will just be mostly, I think, a cluster mode we're kind of stuck in between the trough to the west and the trough to the northeast, so kind of a little bit of ridging in between, mostly just cold frontal storms, clustered, more linear mode there. And then we get into Wednesday. Wednesday, this trough starts to really swing through. We'll go to the GFS here, as the NAM does not quite go out that far. So we'll go to the GFS, 500 millibars. So you see that on Tuesday. Could be an area to watch there, West Texas, as that trough takes shape. And then as we go into Wednesday, that trough swings through. We have some strong flow in the exit region of that trough there across Texas into Oklahoma would be our favored region to support severe weather there. European model shows a similar solution there out across the southern plains on Wednesday. Right out ahead of that into parts of central to northern Texas. As far southern Oklahoma would be the favorite area for that severe threat on Wednesday. Low-level response, not all that robust here. You see perhaps a very weak surface low developing there in northwest Texas. Not really a closed circulation, but should be enough to allow for a tight dry line out ahead of that. Robust moisture out ahead of the dry line right there near the Red River. That would support severe storms. Would not expect to see strong low-level shear here. Maybe a little bit of a low-level jet core out across North Texas eastward, but mostly just, I would think, a large hail and damaging wind risk at this point, given somewhat weaker low-level shear in that setup on Wednesday. Maybe if a storm or two can fire out farther to the east, would be a little bit more favorable, but overall, Wednesday looks like a large hail and damaging wind risk there, but still tight dry line out ahead of a weak surface low. Trough coming in would support severe storms in that region near the Red River on Wednesday. So that's going to wrap things up here. Finally, we'll just take a quick look at the cams for tomorrow just to see if storms, it has any storms firing. So you see today, lots of convective activity, some supercells there out across West Texas into eastern New Mexico near that outflow boundary. And then we go into tomorrow. And you see through the day tomorrow, we stay pretty dry on the HRRR until really through the night, interestingly enough. We stay pretty dry. No storms there across the plains. Let's go to the ARW model. See some storms out there to the west. Supercells today, West Texas, eastern New Mexico. And tomorrow, pretty dry. It does have a storm firing up in West Texas there tomorrow. It's moving pretty fast. Would suspect that might be just an elevated storm there. Look how fast that storm is moving out there across Texas and Oklahoma. Nothing there along the dry line, even in the slight risk area across Nebraska. So the models are definitely on the scant side as far as convection tomorrow goes. And so that lends a little bit of concern. You see the NSSL WRF does initiate storms back here across far western Nebraska by early evening. Nothing along the dry line. So that is concerning. None of our models really have anything Try the RRFS. It's been a lot more reliable lately, so let's take a look at it. And we'll see tomorrow it has nothing here along the dry line. So the model's not liking storm initiation tomorrow. As we talked through it earlier, I do think there is a chance for storm initiation, especially here in western Kansas, near that dry line bulge and potential shortwave for an isolated storm or two. We'll just have to kind of wait and see. Again, observation is going to be critical tomorrow in the morning to see if storms will fire. So that is what is going on right now. We just had a day 2 outlook released here. Very interesting looking slight risk there. So from the start of the video, we had a different outlook. They just put this out within the last few minutes here as we were recording. So this is what they have for, first let's go day 1 today. Again, few supercells out here near the outflow boundary, eastern New Mexico, West Texas. Some regeneration of convection out here across the Red River region today, with a tornado risk maximized in eastern New Mexico, damaging wind, and large to very large hail. Then we get into our outbreak sequence. This is the new day 2 outlook. Slight risk from far northern Kansas up into western Nebraska, western South Dakota up into Montana and North Dakota. Likely would say that's mostly some elevated convection up in there. We see 2% tornado risk. We do have now 2 areas of tornado risk up here. One across eastern Montana into western North Dakota for some storms up there, perhaps overnight. Let's see what they say here. Large-scale ascent focused across this region, especially Sunday evening and night as height falls approach. 2 corridors of initial storm development appear are apparent by early evening, centered on the Nebraska Panhandle and southeast Montana, just ahead of the aforementioned surface low. So they are actually thinking that another surface low may develop out across the southeast Montana vicinity tomorrow to focus storms up in there, and that's actually fairly accurate. So you see this kind of just a broad cyclone, one center here, one center up in here, with easterly flow up in that region, likely some upslope flow there. So could be a severe storm or two up in southeast Nebraska, southeast Montana into western North Dakota tomorrow, with a very low end tornado risk, mostly a large hail and damaging wind risk there. 2% tornado risk does extend down the dry line. Again, storm initiation down there, they say, is very conditional. Here, Kansas to West Texas, a plume of large buoyancy coincident with a supercell wind profile from northwest Texas into western Kansas, forcing for ascent outside of a weakly retreating dryline circulation is nebulous. Thunderstorm probabilities appear to be around 10% or less. So very low-end chance of a storm initiating across this area. Again, we talked about the evidence that is there for potentially initiating a storm or two across western Kansas, but none of the models seem to think that is a possibility at this point, especially our CAMs. So we'll have to just wait and see how that plays out. But the greatest risk should be basically western Nebraska northward into the northern plains tomorrow, with that all hazards risk apparent. Then we go into day 3. That is Monday, and that is our potential tornado outbreak day. Moderate risk, level 4 out of 5, from Iowa into southeast Minnesota, southwest and west Wisconsin, with a large enhancement, slight risk extending out there. I tend to think the convection may be a little bit on the messy side up here near the moderate risk and the northern half of that enhanced risk, given the very sheer boundary parallel deep layer shear vectors and strong forcing, but we could see an isolated supercell or two out both very near the surface low there, kind of the southern Minnesota area, where shear vectors may be a little bit more favorable. Still strong forcing may compensate for that, but could be something to watch there. And also down here in southeast Iowa into northern Missouri, western Illinois on that prefrontal confluence band, with a little bit more weak forcing out in that region and strong wind profiles there. So we'll have to watch that for sure. Down along the dry line here, especially eastern Kansas, northern Missouri, a little bit more discrete mode should be favored, and even down into West Texas, if a storm can fire, discrete supercell mode should be favored with a little bit better shear vector orientation with respect to the initiating boundary, and those could favor that all hazards threat. Significant severe weather, significant damaging winds, and strong tornadoes possible up here from Wisconsin, Minnesota southward near that moderate risk, and also down into eastern Kansas near the western edge of the low-level jet core. Day 4, threat continues. I think the strongest severe storms should be out here across the northeast, the northeast portions of that slight risk that's been drawn for day 4 on Tuesday, ahead of the trough, and then we'll see just scattered severe storms here along the cold frontal boundary stretching back into West Texas. West Texas could be something to watch ahead of that secondary trough that comes in. And then Wednesday, we see that trough fully move through, that secondary trough move through, and a risk for large hail and damaging winds is apparent there out across the North Texas vicinity on Wednesday. So an active stretch ahead, peaking on Monday, but it looks to be a pretty active stretch. Doesn't look like it may rival the outbreaks from this year that we've already seen, but still should be a potent event nonetheless. Still lots of details that need to be worked out before we can get a real specific on the overall threats, where the greatest threats will be, etc. So definitely stay safe the next several days. If you are in these risk areas, have those weather radios handy, have your multiple sources of weather information handy, have a severe weather plan in place in case severe weather strikes your area, and we'll get through this just fine. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.